Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another episode of Checkpoint Coffee, the second one of the new year 2023. And today it's going to be a two-man show. It's going to be me, Mooney, and Iham, and we are going to be talking about dream games. Isn't that right, Iham?
We are.
So, some of you listening might be wondering what we mean by dream games, and it's quite simple. These are basically games that we wish existed. Perhaps it'll be from a certain developer or from a certain franchise. Perhaps it'll be series that no longer are publishing any new games. Perhaps it'll be completely new ideas we bring to the table. But either way, a lot of gamers, us included, do think about this idea, right, Iham?
Yes, I do think about this quite a lot.
Same here. So we thought we'd get two of us on a podcast to talk about it. Okay, so to kick things off, we're gonna hear about Iham's ideal game or dream game. One of them, anyway. So take it away.
So, here's a little bit of a backstory of me. So, when I was a kid, I don't usually watch a lot of cartoons. Instead, I watch a lot of Net Geo channels. Due
Hmm.
to that, I have a really big interest on different mythologies, different countries, and all of those stuff. Recently, due to my studies, I have been studying things like culture, tradition, art, people, and also architecture. But
Right.
also, but very recently, there was a game that actually made me realize how important these things are to a country or a region. For me, it feels like those are things that define that area.
It kind of gives them an identity that is unique to them, right?
Yes, that's exactly my point.
So you
To
want to
keep,
see this kind of stuff represented in games. So any specific genre that you were thinking? Any developer? Anything like that?
I actually thought of two developers, but the reason why I'm choosing this developer is because it their game is the one that made me realize this,
Hmm.
which is actually Mihoyo, the ones who
Oh,
created Genshin Impact.
okay. Interesting. So you want MiHoYo to make a game that showcases a different culture. Which one? And what kind of game would it be? This is interesting. I've seen a lot of their different regions like Inazuma and Liyue and Mondstadt and also Sumeru. And there's a lot of attention, as you say, paid to the architectural details, to the dressing styles, to the various foods that are available in stands and whatnot, and creates a very interesting image. So, what are you looking for MiHoYo to potentially create, ideally speaking?
So I was thinking about what kind of cultures that I want. So when I was thinking that my first idea came from a movie that I watched pretty recently, which was Black Panther Wakanda Forever. Have you
Mm-hmm.
watched that movie, Moni?
Not yet, and no spoilers for the audience either. So, what did you get out of this movie? Which culture
So,
did you kind of get drawn towards?
so the thing is that you know Nemo, right?
I do.
So Nemo's country is actually based on Aztec.
Like their culture and architecture and civilization.
Those stuff also, but also tradition, people, like basically everything related to Aztec.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yes, I want them to see MiHoYo trying to make a game which is inspired by Aztec culture, tradition, basically everything about Aztec.
That's pretty interesting. What drew you to this culture in particular?
So there are basically two reasons. One reason is I actually like their art. So the second reason that I chose Aztec is because I want to know about this Aztec culture and traditions.
You know what? I really like the idea. Maybe it can be a new region of Genshin, or maybe it could be something a little bit more new and original. Who knows? But so far, if you look at their beautiful depiction of Liyue and Inazuma, you can see that they know how to do this kind of research and know how to depict those cultures, at least, pretty faithfully in the game, right? In a way that still feels like it's a natural part of the world. In fact, like recently, I believe the game Genshin Impact is going through its Lantern Rite Festival, which is kind of like a Chinese celebration, right? And yet
Yes.
it feels like in the game, it is very much a thing that they just celebrate in this particular country, which is kind of interesting.
So there is one thing that I want MiHoYo to recreate, that is one of the capitals of Aztec Empire. You know, Moni, this is where Mexico City is actually founded on, like on the ruins of this
Oh,
capital.
That's fascinating.
And you can actually see some of the ruins in the historical center in Mexico City.
Oh, that's fascinating. All right, so we will be putting the name of the city on the screen here, mostly because we can't quite figure out how to pronounce it and we don't want to get it wrong and offend anyone. So, there you go. I think it would be really cool to see such an interesting city recreated in the video games. I mean, we've seen stuff like Assassin's Creed, which recreated pretty faithful recreations of older cities, right? So the potential is definitely there. And I think your idea is really interesting. Good pick.
Thanks. So, Moni, what's your dream game?
There are a few, but for this podcast, I've narrowed it down to just two, right? So I'm going to start off with the first one. It is a Star Wars first-person role-playing game done in the style of or by Obsidian Entertainment. Now, the reason why I picked this, for people who are fans of their games, should be very clear. These people are really good at doing, these first-person role-playing games. They gained a measure of fame for their excellent work on Fallout New Vegas, which to this day is thought to be one of the best role-playing games out there. And they have their own little franchise, budding franchise going with the Outer Worlds series. The second game has been announced. The first one was okay, but there's certainly room for improvement. It had its good points, it had its bad points. But the point is, these guys are masters at taking you and helping you get immersed in a world and just roleplay and make a bunch of choices and have a bunch of factions that you influence with all of your decisions. So, of all the fictional worlds out there, I think a lot of people might want to experience such a deep dive into a world like Star Wars, right? So maybe you can go to Tatooine, meet up with some of the bounty hunters, deal with the Jedi, who knows? But the fact that these games offer like a high level of character customization, a lot of player choice, a lot of fun and memorable NPCs, some really cool companions to go along the way. Star Wars, I feel like, is the perfect fit for something like that. And I would certainly love to see a game like that. What do you think, Ian?
On the top of my head, I have just one question. So, why
Yeah.
are you choosing Obsidian Entertainment over Bethesda?
I suppose the big reason for that would be that back in the day, Bethesda released Fallout 3, which is considered to be a pretty good game for the people who like it. And then, like, less than 2 years later, Obsidian Entertainment, known by another name at the time, released Fallout New Vegas using repurposed assets of the first game, right? So, despite the short development time, despite the lack of like proper support because they had to make do with a lot of what was built for the earlier game, they managed to make a role-playing masterpiece. And it's not just like the hard work they did or whatever, but like the fact that the quality of the writing was really good as well. And I've played a few Bethesda RPGs, and I mean, I do enjoy my time with them, but I'm not sure that I enjoy them for quite the same reasons or the same way that I do for Outer Wilds or Fallout New Vegas, especially Fallout New Vegas. There are some characters there that are still quite memorable, that some lines of dialogue as well that stick, some story beats that are quite good. I think that they have what it takes to create a gripping story that's not just like a shallow theme park version of Star Wars where there's like 100 quest markers and you can't go from one location to the other without going through a cave or two. I'm just saying that when it comes to these kind of things, I think that these people tell a better story.
That's a really interesting take. I do have another question. Have
Uh-huh.
you thought of a certain setting for the game in the Star Wars universe?
I haven't, all right? Because a part of me thinks that when people play Star Wars games, maybe they want to play as a Jedi, right? But then there are also people who really like that Han Solo bounty hunter, guy in his pistol vibe, right? So maybe the perfect game, if they are doing it in this dream scenario, would be a game where you get to choose. Because Knights of the Old Republic is a Star Wars game where you get to choose whether you want to dabble really extensively in the Force or not, right? What kind of character you want to be, what kind of weapon you want to use, what kind of alignment you want to have. It's, I think, a big part of the fantasy, so giving people the choice might be really fun. As for the setting, Star Wars is set in this really big galaxy with a lot of different kinds of planets and a lot of interesting points in its timeline. So maybe a timeline where the Jedi are still around, and there's some sort of conflict going on. I don't know, could be fun.
I was certainly going to bring up Knights of the Old Republic, but if I get to choose between Jedi or Sith, I might choose the sit version
You
because
know,
I want to
if it is
know.
Obsidian doing this kind of game, you can definitely be sure that there'll be a lot of factions that you'll have to kind of navigate. You can't please everybody.
Yeah, so we I think we have seen how good the Jedi's are in the hero's point of view, but I want to
Hmm.
know the complete opposite
Ah. Well then, if that is the
because I
case,
have.
perhaps the Age of the Old Republic, you know?
Yes, because I have read some of the abilities of both sides, and for me, the sit side have a pretty unique abilities, so that's why I'm pretty
Oh, yeah.
biased over there.
I say, well, I must admit, Force Lightning is pretty cool, but you know, it's supposed to be coming from a really dark place, so who knows? But hey, that was my first pick for this podcast. So let's talk about you again. So, what about your second pick? What is an ideal or dream game that you would like to see?
Recently, there was a very personally, it was a very sad news for me, which is that Naughty Dogs is gonna stop making Uncharted games. Personally, Uncharted is a very special game for me because adventure games are something which I really like. Also, Treasure Hunter
Hey,
2.
you know what? Me too. I love them too. And I was also really sad to hear that the Uncharted series will not be one of their foci going forward. But I'm really excited to hear what you have to say. Go on.
Instead of continuing Uncharted, I think Naughty Dog should make another franchise or a game which follows the theme of treasure hunting and adventure.
You know what? I agree with you. I really love the Uncharted games myself. I think that they're really great times. It's kind of like watching and playing through an action movie, right? It's got really cool characters, it's got interesting like locations that you go to, it's got really cool gunfights sometimes, and it has a lot of potential, this whole adventure genre of games, and I would be definitely sad to see it go. I'm with you. I think it would be really cool to see some sort of revival of this genre. Who knows? Maybe we could get an Indiana Jones series. I feel like Uncharted has just been kind of like a dry run for Indiana Jones anyway. And what else? Or maybe we could get one of these stories maybe back in the past, you know, where we don't have like really usable guns and stuff like that. I think that this is a really interesting area with a lot of potential. Is there anything more specific that you'd like to see in a game like this?
So I thought about where the setting of this game would be, and after thinking for a really long time, I think it's time for us to be on the world map.
Us
So
as in the Maldives?
yes.
Oh, I like where you're going with this. An adventure game set in the Maldives, hunting some sort of secret buried treasure. I mean, it's a fictional game, so maybe the treasure doesn't have to be real, but I think that Maldives has a really interesting history that a lot of people could pull from. A lot of really beautiful archaeological sites, and there's some cool artifacts that belong to our historical figures as well. So I think there's potential here. It could be something. I like it.
So after Naughty Dog finished making their next game, I hope that they can make this dream game of mine.
You know what? Maybe after finishing their next game, they'll take a vacation to the Maldives and they'll see the sun, the sea, the sand, and all the great things that we have around here. And they'll be like, you know what? This would be the best place to set our next game.
Okay, Mooney. So what's your second dream game?
All right. So, a lot of people like to talk about how From Software should make a Berserk game, you know? And I can see the appeal. I think that would be pretty interesting. But here is my idea of what they should do. I think that it would be really cool to see a From Software 3D take on Castlevania. Now, I say this for a few reasons. Now, first of all, I think that in the modern era, the Castlevania series is kind of on hiatus, and that's a crying shame. And secondly, I also think that in terms of gothic horror, interesting monster design, really cool lore, and whatnot, FromSoft is really killing it right now. And before Sekiro, I would have said that they had a little bit of trouble with storytelling versus world building. And I know that for some people that might be a bit of a hot take, but I've always felt like these games had better lore than the immediate story that was going on. Because most of the time, you're kind of like an archaeologist going through a party that's already ended, just figuring out what happened based on item descriptions. Not to say this is a bad thing, I personally really like this kind of storytelling, but I think that a story like Castlevania deserves a more active protagonist, a more active kind of storytelling. And Sekiro, to me, offered that kind of storytelling from Software, right? So maybe they can start off with a game where they make whip combat really awesome. You know, they can have some of the sub weapons and whatnot, and they could create their own Belmont. They could create all these cool bosses that exist in various parts of the castle, and all these strange items, the item descriptions and whatnot, slowly fleshing out the setting and whatnot. I think it would be a perfect fit. What do you think, I am?
You have basically answered my first question, as in why you picked FromSoft. My second question is the same as the last one. Do you have a certain setting for the games? I'm not really familiar with the Castlevania stories.
Let me fill you in then. And for anybody else who might not be aware, one of the cool things about Castlevania is that usually it always takes place in Dracula's castle. This castle, which disappears and appears, which gets ruined and rebuilt for every game. It's a thing. And the real appeal here is kind of like JoJo's, in the sense that it is the same family and their conflicts against this grand evil throughout the years. So the different games always pick up with a new Belmont, and they take on Dracula in their lifetime, and they make sure that he doesn't do something to mess up the world or whatever. When it comes to settings, usually it tends to be Europe, usually it tends to be during the Gothic period, right? So I think that it pretty much falls into From Software's aesthetic, whether they go Victorian London like Bloodborne or a little bit more knights and armor like Dark Souls or Demon Souls. I think that they could really nail it, because Castlevania is an interesting series aesthetically. It takes place in what seems like somewhat medieval-esque times, slowly getting more and more closer to the present. But the monsters there are, well, they started out as a mishmash of movie monsters before they kind of evolved into their own things. So you get to see stuff like Frankenstein's monster or Medusa or other more modern monsters that couldn't have existed in this time period, but still mishmashed together inside Dracula's castle, which is one of the unique fun things about Castlevania. And when they started inventing their own monsters, you get like skeletons on motorbikes and stuff like that. And I think that's kind of cool, and FromSoft could definitely do a lot with that. Another thing about Castlevania is that because it takes place inside Dracula's castle, you explore a lot, find shortcuts, and slowly progress through this entire interconnected level. And if that does not describe Dark Souls 1, I do not know what does. So you see, I am like, these guys have been kind of making Castlevania for a long time without directly making Castlevania. It's not one for one, but there are enough similarities there for me to believe that they could really nail it.
With that, I want to ask that do you want FromSoft to incorporate Metroidvania genre into this?
The question of whether Castlevania should be 2D or 3D is an entire podcast in and of itself. But here's what I have to say. I think that because Konami is so determined to have the next great Castlevania be a 3D game, like Lords of Shadow or whatever, that it's okay for it to be 3D. And even if it isn't the side-scrolling Metroidvania that we are all familiar with, if they could deliver a castle that feels interconnected, a bunch of characters that are memorable, a story that is interesting, fights that are really cool, and mechanics that are the traditional kind of FromSoft polished, I think that fans would really appreciate it. It's like the spirit of the Metroidvania type of Castlevania is being carried by different folks in the indie scene right now, and mainstream games have kind of moved on to a more 3D space, I think. So in that, if we are still going to have Castlevania, why don't we let FromSoft do it? Because I feel like they could really do a good job.
So I have another question for you, Moni. So do you want a remake of a certain game or a continuation?
That's actually a tough one. A part of me thinks that remaking some of the older games in this newer 3D style could be pretty cool, but I tend to favor originality more than just repeats. So I think what I would like to see is for them to just do Castlevania separate from the Lords of Shadow. Not really sure whether it should be connected to the original timeline. I mean, if it is, that's pretty cool, but even if it isn't, just starting anew in that appropriate time period with the same vibes and just that classic story of a Belmont versus Dracula, the struggle versus good and evil, to save the world. I think that would just be really cool. And who knows, maybe they'll add some twists and turns along the way. Maybe they'll make the darkest Castlevania game yet, but I don't know. I just think that these guys are the people to do it if Konami won't do it.
I think this is the first FromSoft game that a protagonist will have a name.
I don't know. Wolf is kind of a name. But on that note, that's kind of all the time we have for this episode. Thank you so much, Iham, for joining me on this great talk. I hope you had fun, because that was really cool hearing your ideas.
Same to you.
I hope the listeners out there also enjoyed our little walk down speculative lane to kind of imagine what some of the cool games that could exist would be in an ideal scenario. Now, if you have any similar games that you wish would exist, particular genre, particular developer, please let us know in the comments below. In the meantime, thank you for tuning in, and we will see you in the next one. Bye bye.
Bye.
That's gonna be it for this episode of Checkpoint Coffee. Thanks for listening, folks. Give us a like and subscribe if you're listening to us on YouTube. Or rate our performance on Spotify, Anchor, Castbox, or Google Podcasts. We'll meet you again next month for more gaming and pop culture reviews and discussions.